September 2006. That's where probably, for me at least, this evening kind of started, because that's the month in which I moved to London from India, and I've been here, a planner here ever since. But I remember all of us probably been in one of those big integrated campaign presentation meetings where we've got 20-odd people in the room, loads of clients, and of course this is a completely dysfunctional, but the special thing in it for me was that back where we started, and my first client was Unilever, there were two planners in that room. There was me, and there was a media planner from Mindshare, which is literally the floor below us. Nobody else was called a planner. Cut to roughly 10 or so years later, and no prizes for guessing what you're looking at in front of you. These are all, one might sort of cynically called prefixes. These are all planners. And these are all designations or titles that have actually come from our own survey, which I'll talk about in a second. But these are all planners. They're brand planners, PR planners, CRM planners, and so on and so forth. So if you just watch that kind of shift, and in a similar meeting that involves 20 people, you will, I kid you not, probably have half a dozen planners, if not more. So what has changed between there just being a planner and a media planner to 20 and growing kinds or types of planners? And that sort of made me think, and we at the APG have been thinking about what is happening to planning and planners, and this diversification or fragmentation. What does it mean? Does it mean, for example, that planners become increasingly salespeople for the product that they represent rather than being strategists? And therefore, the worst outcome of all of this is that you say, well, social is the answer, what is the question? And that is certainly not what we want strategists or planners to be. So that was sort of question number one. And the other point really is the context in which we are having this conversation is really, really interesting, because there is a lot of death in our industry. You'll agree with me that advertising and television have been dead for a good decade or more. There are other things that are dying. I believe even audio is dying on Facebook. And of course, will that day come when planning or planners also face the same fate, or will they not? So roughly the context in which we need to ask this question is also very, very interesting. And if you look at the sort of particularly dystopian scenario of this playing out, you're looking at this being the agency of the future, where the human being you see is not actually a planner or a creative person, but he's just the IT guy who comes to do his weekly maintenance. So the context, as Sarah was talking about, is really, really interesting, because we need to now examine what we do as strategists or planners, whatever we choose to call ourselves, in this context, and should we be doing more of something or less of something, and so on and so forth. So we sort of went about trying to figure out what we can do about this, and we asked ourselves the question: what might make a 2020 strategist, and 2020 being a particularly bad and cheap pun of both the year as well as having perfect vision? What would make a strategist who is good enough to be that? And in doing that, obviously, the end goal would probably be that we would launch a training course. But before that, we wanted to not subjectively decide, we know everything that's going on, so let's launch a course. So we wanted to do proper homework. And that homework sort of involved meeting roughly 25 of the top CSOs, one or two CEOs. You may be able to spot people you know in this list. You may be able to spot yourself in this list if you're one or two people here. But we sort of had an hour-long conversation with all of these people. And the thing I want to point out to you here is that we particularly wanted to meet as diverse a set of experts or senior people as we could. So we went to the sort of old-fashioned agency types like me, you'd be very pleased to know that I did interview my boss, Guy Murphy. And we also went to some of the people who have moved away from the overall integrated agency model. So we tried to meet as many different people as possible and learned from them. We chatted a lot about what the state of the industry is, what they think planning is going to be, and what planners need to do, and so on and so forth. And then we sort of came up with the idea that if we've run a survey and had a chat with experts, for lack of a better word, we should probably do that amongst the planning community as well. So we then ran another survey, which some of you may have been a part of, where we asked people in our membership list what skills they think planners and strategists need in order to thrive in the future. And for those of you who have completed the survey, you'll remember that we picked on 24 skills, which I'll come and talk to you about in a second. We talked about 24 skills and asked them to rate these skills on a scale of 0 to 10. 10 being the highest, you cannot be a planner or a strategist without this skill, and 0 being the lowest, which is sort of you really do not need to bother having this skill at all. And so the question is, at that time anyway, would these ratings be different? Would they be similar? What skills would come up? What skills would be a complete car crash for a planner to have? What skills would be good to have? So here are the top skills a strategist must have. Here are the 24 that we looked at. Again, try to look at a diversity of skills that one should have. And what do you think was the top-rated skill of these? Sorry? Understanding technology. Any other guesses? Storytelling. Understanding people. Defining problems. Unearthing insight. Understanding people. Sorry? Selling an idea, yeah, that could be a top skill. And both our experts, as well as the 317 people who responded, who roughly represent 10% of their universe, have said that understanding people is the most important skill that a planner or strategist should have going forward in the future. And that's interesting. On the one hand, you may say, what? That's it? Nothing more than that? Or on the other hand, especially if you're closer to my age than to 20, you might say, thank goodness they said that. But this is universally the top-rated skill. And the top 3 rated skills amongst the experts were as follows. Understanding people, defining a problem was, again, the number 2 rated skill, both amongst the general survey as well as amongst CSOs. I'm just going to use this, the CSO term approximately. And the third top rated skill, actually the second one amongst the experts, was understanding effectiveness, which is somewhere here in the middle. It was rated highly by the general survey as well. But understanding people, defining a problem, and understanding effectiveness. And by understanding effectiveness, what we mean is knowing how things work, how communication works, were the top 3 skills. And you can see that there's a beautiful declining scale of the top-rated skill. And they are more or less, barring a couple of exceptions, they're more or less following a very, very similar pattern, which at least to us was fascinating, absolutely fascinating, that there seems to be a great amount of consistency in what all of us are saying about the skills a planner should have. A couple of aberrations. You can see that understanding UX was rated higher in the general survey than in the experts. You can see that understanding data was rated slightly differently. But largely speaking, that was the pattern. And now the next question to ask is, we did have enough representation from different agency types. So what's that picture looking like? Do digital agencies rate these skills very differently from brand integrated agencies? Do media agencies rate these differently? So we thought we'd have a look at those as well. And here is, again, an incredibly consistent pattern. So I think this is probably one of the most fascinating things, that the rating of skill does not differ that much or does not change that much based on agency type. There are a couple of aberrations. You will find that the brand consultancy, that the sample is 14. So, I mean, it is very, very small, but indicative that effectiveness is not that big on their agenda. But you'll find that because of the way we defined it, I suppose, but you'll find that the pattern is really, really consistent. And this is fascinating, absolutely fascinating. And as I said, reassuring for some of us, and we'll find out in the next half an hour or so whether it's reassuring to everybody or not. The other thing that was worth looking at is, the more senior you are, the more tens you tended to give. And there is a rising pattern which could be highly troubling if you're a particularly junior person, because your bosses are expecting more and more and more of you. Of the 24 skills, there's another chart that I'm going to spoil for you now, but on average, the most senior people who are 15 years plus gave more than 8 tens. That means of the 24, on an average, they thought 8 of these were tens, not 1 or 2 of these, but 8 of these were tens, which means that you've got to be good at a bloody long list of things, and no pressure, therefore. Whereas I can totally understand the plight of the junior people who tended to not rate that many skills as number 10. But these are the sort of the first 12, and you can see more or less that kind of pattern repeats itself in the other skills as well. So on an average, as we said, there was 6.5 tens given at the junior end and 8 plus tens given. So that means there are all sorts of phrases for it. The rise of the T-shaped planner or strategist. You need to have your specialty, but you need to be equally good at lots and lots of things, is probably what this indicates, for if not anything else. But I thought also I wanted to touch upon what all of this might mean and what all of this meant. And going back to the conversations which we have done over the last 6 months or 7 months, and going back to all of the things that people have said, I've pulled together 3 big themes that are probably observations of, or implications, if you will, of what we have learned so far. The first of these is that there is a consistent frustration amongst the planning community that we spoke to about an increasingly either-or world, an increasingly polarized world that at least marketing is living in. So on the one hand, you could be sort of friends of Byron Sharp, which means, in other words, that you are a big fan of broad reach, broad targeting, making sure that you talk to light users, making sure that you have many copies of the book, and talking about effectiveness and so on and so forth. So you belong to that camp, or you belong to the other camp, which largely says, all of you clever people, all of your charts and all of your strategies, all you do is end up recommending a 30-second spot. I mean, you are not capable of doing anything else. But look at the world and how it's evolved, and look at the world that data and technology has created, and so on and so forth. And interestingly, not one of the experts that we met was firmly in one camp or the other, but they are frustrated by the obsession that you absolutely have to be in one camp and probably decry the other, because obviously sitting on the fence is probably not a very good idea for your private parts. And therefore, you deliberately needed to take a stance of one side or the other. Now, that itself it sort of raises many questions. One of those questions, obviously, is increasingly a strategist struggling to fight their own corner? And therefore, can they only fight their own corner by whether they've ended up being in one camp or the other by default? Can they only fight their own corner by decrying the other, sort of like how election campaigns are run now? Or is there something else? And that's worth thinking about. But increasingly, there's a frustration that we need to get rid of the good or the evil. One is good, the other is evil, and use old world, timeless principles, but equally apply them to the new. Be enthusiastic about the new, and don't be shy of the new. And equally on the other camp, be excited about the new, but put these in the right perspective. Put them in the perspective of how communications works, and realize that understanding people is really core to what we do. This point is about sort of what is beautifully captured in the movie, which is playing the orchestra. And long gone, we learn are the days where you could sport a ponytail and sort of disappear to the beach for a week and come back with the answers. And for that week, nobody had to do anything because you knew that the strategist was at work. Those days are gone because you simply will not be able to be a specialist at all of the things that involve strategy, and therefore you need to be able to manage other strategists and people in order to be the best at what you do. And you cannot just be a specialist to all of them yourself, and therefore having to work in teams and having to work with other people, particularly with other kinds of strategists, was incredibly important. And it is sort of a soft skill, a soft, touchy-feely kind of skill where you're not necessarily being required to bring out your intelligence necessarily, but you're being asked to work with a particular geek, for example, who might think the brand is a dirty word. I mean, and you might have to work with them. You might have to work with people who do not like being in a meeting of more than 2 people. You might have to work with these guys and really understand what they have to bring to the table, and not just be the person who can solve it all. So especially, we learned as you grow more and more and more senior, you will have to equally become a manager of other planners and a manager of orchestrator of other planning skills, as much as you try and become a planning rock star yourself. So that was the third skill, and now let's talk about the second skill, which was the sort of difference between a grand strategist, a planner who's able to have business conversations with the clients, and a strategist who was further and further downstream. And a significant number of people expressed the fear that if a planner or a strategist gives up the spot of being the person that the client will phone and say, can we just have lunch? When are you free? And at that lunch, they talk about what their targets are. They're being asked to deliver an extra $500 million in 3 years' time, and they haven't a clue as to where to begin. As of today, at least, probably in a good 4 out of 5 occasions, the senior strategist is the people that they would have that lunch with. But increasingly, if planners become more and more specialist and they go further and further downstream, are we vacating that spot for someone else to come and take over? So there was a great amount of anxiety, for lack of a better word, to be that person and to not let go of being a thoroughly well sort of versed with business and client issues and not just be a specialist at your particular issue. So those were the sort of 3 themes that we talked about and that we learned. And my conclusion from all of that, before we invite our panelists, was that this was really interesting. So if you look at the top 3 skills, on the one hand, the top skill was understanding people. The second rated skill was understanding effectiveness, as in understand business, understand the business of communications and how it creates an effect for the client. And in between was sort of defining a problem. So if you indulge my rather poor animation skills for a second, I've sort of illustrated that for you because I thought you might like it. So on the one hand, you have a client problem. What you do is you toss that around. How does that impact people? What do people need to do in order to get the business problem? And somewhere in between, you define the problem, and you're able to connect the business issue with an understanding of people. And that's really what the skill that a planner or a strategist needs to have. And if I had to really summarize the sort of 6-month journey in 12 words, it would probably be this, which is it's about what you need to do is you need to leverage a rich understanding of people. And the idea is not to have a rich understanding of people, because there are research agencies that do that. You need to leverage a rich understanding of people to achieve the desired outcome, not to achieve a desired outcome, which may be, hey, we have grown, but the desired outcome, which is it must be premeditated, and you must know what outcome you're trying to achieve. And I say business in sort of brackets because it doesn't always have to be a commercial outcome. It can be sometimes a non-commercial outcome. So that really is probably a 12-word summary of what we seem to have learned and what planners ought to be all about.